Today to have Randy Lee, the VP of Global Business Development for CrowdStar, here to tell us about navigating the gaming market in Asia. Randy.
Great. Thanks for having me. I know a lot of you are eating or just finished eating, so appreciate you guys coming in to this segment. So a little bit about CrowdStar. Let's see, how's this? I don't know how to use a PC here. Nope, that way? Yep. So we were founded back in 2008. We were pretty much born on Facebook, so had a couple big game titles on Facebook. We had Happy Aquarium, Happy Pets. I don't know if you guys have played those games. And then It Girl was a big fashion title we had. And about a year ago, we moved over to mainly do mobile titles. And so now the company is focused on the mobile social side of games. And our demo is still pretty consistent with what it's always been, which is kind of the young female. So anywhere from the age of 14 to about 30 years old, kind of the young female demo. That's our niche. Our investors are Time Warner and Intel Capital. And again, it's kind of the focus for us has been this demo from the get-go. The process about going international started about a year and a half ago when I joined CrowdStar, which is over 2 years ago. And one of the things we wanted to do was to go to the international piece of it. One way, we looked at it really in two segments. One was more for the business side of things, how can it help your top line growth, those type of things. The other one was more strategic. It's having some success here in the U.S. Kind of what's the next territories to go after, and people always go, well, let's go to Asia. So before we actually went to Asia, we first went to Eastern Europe and Russia, and then that was kind of a step forward. And then really the big move is, okay, now what do we do in Asia? We have a bunch of titles. They've done very well here in the US. They've done well on Facebook. So how can we bring those out to the Asia Pac? So I'll go through some of the things we did, from a high level, talk about the approach that we used, the assessments of the market, the execution piece, which ends up being a lot more than you may think, and then really the launch and the thought process behind kind of where we were when we started it and then where we were when we launched the games. So as of today, we did launch, 2 titles in China, 1 in Korea, and then 2 web games, 1 in Japan and another 1 in China. So when we started the process was let's get to Korea, China, and Japan. A year and a half later, we actually are in all 3 of those countries with live games and partnerships that were done. When the process first started, it's like, let's do the management consulting kind of way. Let's look at the different markets. We all know that there's some big gaming markets out there, but being kind of a US developer with limited resources, let's pick the best ones to go after and then really make the move there. So if you're the MBA student or the consultant thing, you kind of go, okay, let's look at each market, and you do your typical things. You look at the population, you look at smartphone penetration, and you look at these numbers, you go, okay, Japan, everyone knows, 128 million people, smartphone is going through the roof. China, at the time, smartphone growth was slower when I first entered the market. Now it's since picked up quite a bit. And then Korea is just a very gaming country and it's down into the culture of it. So it makes sense to look at these, and then you kind of compare that to the US, 314 million people. You compare that to China, you go 1.3 billion. Wow, what a great opportunity. So we looked at each country separately because they are all very different. And then we also looked at kind of the average kind of DAU per game, the ARPU per game, and per title. And it's very different than it is here. So in Japan, you may go, okay, it's a low DAU market, but it's a very high ARPU market, right? In China, it's a huge DAU market. It's a very low ARPU market. So how do you monetize there? And in each of these countries, it was very much a very different kind of play where we went into. And from me and the CrowdStar side is we have 1 game. So we have a title that we want to bring there that did very well here in the US. The one we were pushing was Top Girl. It was a top grossing title on iOS. Now let's look at these markets and figure out how do we position it in. And kind of the high level approach was market analysis. And then if you dig down deeper and deeper, it's like, okay, the type of gamers you have there and what would fit the segment. We even went into looking at kind of the grossing charts and segmented pink for female games, and that's where we are. So where do the female games lie in the grossing charts? To where do the male games lie in the grossing charts? And that does tell you a little bit about, like in Japan when we looked, there were actually a lot of female type games in the grossing charts, whereas in China there weren't a lot of female type games in the grossing charts. So you get a sense of, okay, as a female developer of games, when you go in the markets, what are the opportunities there? Can you really crack that piece of it if there aren't a lot of female titles in the top grossing charts? So there was quite a bit of initial assessment that happened there, I would say maybe 4 months of it, of just kind of understanding the market, hearing the news, making quite a bit of visits. Here's just a quick slide. When you look at the China market, for example, the 1.3 billion people, you go, okay, look at all these SNS platforms. So for us growing up on Facebook, we understood the platform, we knew how to use the platform, and it's just like, it's very critical for us doing social games on integrating into the local platforms. So this one's a little bit hard to see, but there's always obviously the equivalents to the Facebooks out there. In China, there's Tencent. They have their Qzone, they have their Pengyou platforms. You look at these numbers, you go 600 million, 250 million. Tencent has their Weibo platform where you can do some integration on. So every number you see in China will be a very big number. So if you think about it that way, you say, great, I have this game, I have a giant number of user base, and there should be some pretty good business there. And I'll kind of walk through that, and at the end kind of tell you what we found. But if you go by that route of things, and you do kind of a top-down analysis, and you look at the local games, and you do hear stories like Puzzles and Dragons in Japan is killing it. I think it's they're doing like $3-4 million a day, and you go, okay, great. It's a low DAU market, huge ARPU market. Can my game succeed there? And I think you have to look at both things. You have to look at your game and how that would fit in that market, and then you have to look at the market itself and seeing if it'll absorb and it'll accept your titles. I think I skipped one. So during the assessment process, I made a lot of trips. I made a lot of trips to China, mostly, and a bunch of trips to Japan, and then a few to Korea. I think China, to me, was the one with the biggest challenge in terms of trying to understanding the market because of the different platforms. So you have the traditional gaming guys where, whether it's Tencent that are doing games and people who've done games. Renren had games groups. Kaixing was doing games. So the traditional SNSs were all doing games. But then you can meet other players as well because like Taobao, kind of like the eBay guys, right? They were getting into games. Qihoo 360, which is like a big virus anti-spam software. They take over your browser, but they give you anti-spamming software to help you. They have games portals. So almost everybody I talk to in China, when I tell them I'm a kind of a Western developer wanting to go on the market, we're doing games. So started off from the platforms, and then you talk to a bunch of publishers that were all publishing Western titles, and then you actually look at local developers, and then Western developers that were there. So met a lot of people from like EA that kind of built up camp out in China and what they've been trying to do. So quite a lot of meetings, a lot of discussions about their publishing strategy. Like it's very important to ask how many games do they publish, what kind of distribution do they put in, of the games they publish, how well do they perform on average, and then you can get a range. And they always have a success story, and then there's always the ones that just kind of don't do well, right? So let's say they have their portfolio of 10 games a year, or there will be some publishers out there that do 50 games a year. And to be able to assess each of the partners and triangulate kind of where the market is at, and that's kind of, I think that's probably the biggest challenge. Because after you meet with 20, 30, 40 different partners, you do get different stories from each of them. So here's some partner data I got from one of them. 70 million users, and you go, wow, okay, wow, that's a big. Weekly active users, 8 million. App downloads, they do 5 million a day off Platform X on iOS and 5 million a day on Android. Again, every number you're ever going to hear out there are very big numbers that even if you can get a little piece of that pie, you're going to say, okay, this makes business sense. And I think when we first started again, remember we talked about looking at it from a kind of a two-pronged strategy. One is, does it make business sense to do it? And two is the market ready for your game? Is your game good enough for that market, and is that what the user base is telling you? So going through the meetings, we basically narrowed it down to a couple of top partners. So Ended up in China. I did a deal with Tencent, so they took 2 of our games out there. Stayed on iOS because at the time the Android platform was still very young. Monetization was even less. And then there were just too many markets, right? There was, I think, 20, 30, 40, 50 plus Android markets that you can partner with. And for us being a US-based developer, we weren't big. It was trying to find the right partner that can actually do the full turnkey solution for you. So that's kind of determining the best business model. There are ones that will take your code. Do you trust them to take your code? That's a big question. They will, no. So they could take your code. They can localize it, culturalize it, and they'll be in charge of everything. And certain publishers or developers want that. Just give it away, come back to me in 6 months when you launch, and then just cut me checks. There's other ones that are a little bit more hands-on, and I think for us, we want to take that hands-on approach because it's mainly a learning process. If you went with the first process, which is just give them the code and cut checks, I don't think you'll learn much. Right? You count on that partner to do everything, and at the end, if it doesn't work out and the game doesn't work, you actually didn't learn anything from that relationships and from that market. So our approach was actually to be a little bit more hands-on. We had a project manager that worked with that team, weekly calls on how that worked. And that kind of goes to the nitty-gritties of the execution piece of it. So business legal contracts, so we worked through those in Japan, we worked through those in Korea, and we worked through those in China. That's just the typical piece of it. How do you structure the deal? What kind of rev share you want? Who's doing the customer service per se? Who's doing the marketing and distribution? The translation was obviously the no-brainer. Everyone goes, okay, the game has to be culturalized. But then it comes down to the SNS platform evaluation, like which platform is the best one for us? And that was, looking at the Tencent SDKs. Now you have all these messaging apps out there, Line, Kakao, right? They're all doing this, WeChat. They're all doing these messaging type apps. So who would do the integration for that? Your local team here. So ours was still working on the US product, working on Facebook integration and things like that. But who would do the work for you there? And then the culturalization. To me, the culturalization was actually one of the things a lot of the partners pushed back on that they wanted a little bit more of. So going in, you may think, okay, I just translate this game. It could potentially be a big hit in China or Japan or Korea. But what it comes down to is that you start getting some feedback and they go, okay, you have to culturalize this. We went from not just changing an outfit to be more Asian, but we actually had to their hairstyles had to change. We actually put different types of drapes in one of our games to make it feel more Asian. Some of the communities within Top Girl, instead of being like New York, we had to use kind of some Beijing places, so it made more sense there. And this is all kind of work where you don't really think about when you go in that actually adds up in terms of kind of cost and time. So this whole process, again, depending on the partner and the implementation, could take up to 6 months to get your game out, right? So translation is easy, but the culturalization piece of it has to get in place, and then really understanding their distribution. So that's one thing I did push quite a bit is, okay, so once we launch the game, how's the distribution going to happen? What marketing areas are you going to be pushing at? And from a CEO level of saying, I'm going to go to Asia, I'm going to conquer these countries. And then as you kind of get down, things just get more complex as you go. So we launched, right? We launched a bunch of different titles. In Japan, it was a web game with our partner, which was NHN, who's kind of where Line came from. That was supposedly the very high ARPU market, and even data from them looking at their games was a very high ARPU market. What we found was that our game did very well on Facebook, and we had like 4 million DAU on the game on Facebook, but it wasn't a high-yielding game. So the game mechanic wasn't like the kind that you saw in Japan. So for Japan to tell you that their ARPU was really high and you actually get data, for you to think that, okay, my game could do that in Japan, it doesn't work like that. And I think that's one of the key learnings. It's like, our game isn't structured to do that. So when you throw it into a country like Japan, where the DAU is low, and the game structure is not one to be really squeezing you to get a high ARPU, you probably won't, a miracle isn't going to happen that all of a sudden your game is going to be 10x ARPU than it was here in the US. You're just going to have a very low DAU game with very low ARPU. So that's one of the key learnings, I think, for us that we found in Japan. The great takeaway from Japan is I got to meet a lot of different partners. Definitely the relationship building takes time, and it's one of those things that now that NHN is doing their thing, we built a relationship with them. Once they launched Line, okay, now there's a Line messaging app. It's done well. You have the relationship that you can kind of keep going. I think Korea was very different. That was not only did they actually have to localize our game and culturalize it, it's a very Android-heavy market, right? Obviously. So for CrowdStar, we're not an Android-heavy development studio. We kind of take games on iOS first, and if it does well on iOS, then we port to Android. So we had a very basic version of Top Girl out there on Android, and that's the version that our partner then took to Korea. That one was definitely not as developed as our iOS one, so it was always a little bit, there was always more work that had to be done. And if you take it to the partner, again, technically we did an evaluation, like can they port it, but there's always going to be issues. So we had a lot of our tech team where I did not think that they would actually have to spend the time to do it, had to actually have to help ramp up the partner. So again, this is another one of those things that takes more time than you would have thought, because during the initial analysis, you get the tech groups to talk and say, yes, everything makes sense, we can do it. You analyze their game, they've launched hundreds and hundreds of Android games. This should be very easy, but they're not familiar with your code. So again, that's something else where it's like, okay, this team is not familiar with the code. It may cost you another 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get the game out. But they have the local relationships, right? So that's really the key, is finding the right partners who have the local relationships. And during that time, you're building your relationships as well. In China, so China to me was one that took quite a bit of, a lot of back and forth on our side in terms of which is the best partner. You can pick the biggest one with the biggest reach and the biggest distribution potential, but can you, again, trust them with your code, right? That's a place where, when I was meeting with one, they had told us, I think the big mechanic at the time was like I think the Smurfs was doing very well here, and what they did was they took a local company took a childhood Chinese character, and they basically mimicked like the Smurfs game, and then they threw in a lot of Fruit Ninja mechanics because they knew that was hot. So these guys just iterate very quickly. They see what's booming in the US, and then they just kind of replicate it and really culturalize it and localize it. So I think Zynga launched Draw Something out there with Sina Weibo, which is a huge partner, 300 million people on Weibo, and that didn't really take off theirs either. So for me, it was building those relationships. I don't know of a lot of companies in China who has made a ton of money. I can't say we're not getting some revenue from our partnership there with Tencent, because we are, but these 3 markets has been very have I looked back to that, it's really trying to understand the partners, trying to figure out which ones are the best ones to work with for that deal and then future deals. So I would say for most developers looking to expand, and there's a lot of Chinese publishers out here, even at this show that I know, who are always like talking about various, I want to take your games to Asia. I would say things that we learned there is that it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. In 6 months, 8 months, you will get a game out. So there's no question about that. But will it perform? Will it be worth the effort that you had versus if you could have been focusing on your own game here? Does the game here that hits really work out there? And your publishing partner will work with you on that, right? They may say this game isn't the best fit. We have another game that's actually monetizes very well here in the U.S., but it's just not the right fit for those markets. And if you pick the right partners, they'll be pretty frank and honest with you. We had a follow-on discussion with Tencent. They're like, look, we'll take this game for you, but I don't think it's going to make you any money. So at that point, then of all the resources you spend from the dev side to the project management side to the legal and contract side, you just have to think about why you're going there. If you're going there to make a big quick buck 6 months later, or you go in there to really put a flag down and say, okay, I've been in the market, I'm learning about the market, and in 3, 4, 5 years, I may have a team there to really develop that market, then it's probably the right thing to do. So if you are thinking about that, I think you just have to take that very strategic route versus taking the route of making the quick buck. So very, very brief presentation. I hope it's kind of a high-level summary of 2 years of experience in 20 minutes. Yeah, I'll open up to any questions you may have.
Quick Q&A.
You have any challenges with the size of the games in terms of having to, I've heard stories where, to be successful in China, you got to be down below 15 megs. People strip out all kinds of features and stuff like that.
Yeah, we didn't. So in China, we did iOS. So iOS is a little bit more high-end users. I think if you go to Android in China, and there's a lot of low-end Android devices, there's going to be a lot of trouble with that. And if you don't trust your partner with the code and you have to work through those, you're never going to support the Android numbers that you find in the stats, right? So take those stats and cut it by 90% because that's going to be your market size. iOS is different, so we actually never had a problem with size on iOS.
Can you talk about the process of working with Kakao and Line and those guys? Is this a strictly pay for placement kind of deal? Are there other rules in place? How's that work?
Yeah, so for Line specifically, because of our relationship, it's not a play for placement. It's very been open. Like, here's the title. Will it work for the platform? And I think the big successful games on there have been very simple, one-button type games. They do like our titles per se because it's more casual for females. So a lot of females are in messaging apps versus kind of the game networks. So that's a big plus for us. But our games aren't that simple. It's not a Rhino that kind of goes from left to right that you hit a button and you jump. So I think the platforms will get there once the gamers become more advanced. But to get the mass distribution, I think to be successful on a Line type platform, you will need a very simple kind of gameplay, the 1-2 button thing that your 3-year-old can pick up, or a Temple Run, kind of that kind of play, versus our type of games are a little bit more complex. We good? Yeah.
Have you released the game on Android in China?
On Android?
Yeah.
No, we haven't yet. It was only iOS, 2 on iOS, not on Android.
Are you working with Android market in China?
So I talked to quite a few different partners on Android there, but never actually taken the step, just because of the work it is to get there, I think. Yeah.
So you said iOS first, obviously Android second. Where does Facebook come into your picture? I mean, you do have games on Facebook too, right?
Yeah. So in Asia, it doesn't, right? In Japan, yes. China, no. In terms of just how we design games, it definitely does come into play on doing the Facebook integration. I mean, you can't ignore it. So yeah, we do use quite a bit of Facebook integration.
But games on Facebook.com, for example.
Oh, so we actually left Facebook a year ago.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, so the question is for us on Facebook. Where does Facebook lie in our priorities in the games? And our last game on Facebook was It Girl. And Wasteland, we did a mid-core, hardcore male game, and then we actually didn't do any more Facebook development after that. So it's all mobile using Facebook as the kind of the social layer.
What steps did you take to protect your code when you worked with your partners?
Yeah. So it depends on the partner. So in China, actually, we were pretty fortunate. One of our minority investors was the Nine. So we actually had them, they're based in Shanghai, we actually had them hold our code. There were quite a few partners that actually wanted to take the code, but we just weren't comfortable with doing that. Japan and Korea is a little bit different, especially depending on, the partners are just more mature. And for them to take your code, I didn't see it happening. And it's, and the way we structured it was that we still owned the code, the localized code. So legally, you probably could have done the same thing in China, but even that, I just, at that time, just wasn't comfortable with giving anybody in China our code. Great. Thank you.